Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents and families everywhere.
Whether you have kids that plan to attend college or you have current college students, you want them in and you want them to graduate.
And you want a quality education that won't have you wrestling back and forth all night wondering how you're going to pay for it. I am Mark Stucker.
And I am Anika Madden, and welcome to episode number 12, How Many Colleges Should Your Kid Apply To? In this week's news, we'll discuss an incredible article that outlines the need for a major overhaul in how colleges evaluate merit. We're in chapter 12 of 171 answers, and we'll discuss the number of colleges that your kid should apply to. And we're taking this week's question segment for Mark to share some great bonus content on our last 5 episodes.
Welcome back, listeners of Your College Bound Kid. And I just want to share a little behind the scenes story for you about what goes on when we record these episodes. So if you've been listening faithfully to our episodes, then you may remember Nika's self-describing herself as a sound snob because she's so precise about having to have sound quality. So we were having our struggles for a while. We kept having some sound issues that were related to the internet. And so Nika was driving like an hour to go to places so she could be on good internet. And she'd drive around the corner and go all over the place. And I was like, Anika, get a hotspot. And she would not listen to me. She had all these other ideas. And so finally, I'm like, I'm just going to be pestering you over and over until you get a hotspot. And guess what? She had a hotspot all along she was paying for. So when she used it, our great sound engineer, Esteban, said that was the best sound quality ever. So I just had to bust your chops, Nika, on that one. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all about the hotspot. But I will say, anybody that's planning on doing a podcast, please call me and Mark first.
That's a really good idea. Let's turn to college admissions hot topics in the news.
All right, Mark, this article this week. Oh, man.
Deep.
Deep. A radical plan to combat inequality in college admissions. And this is found on the psmag.com website. And this author, first of all, is a phenomenal article. And essentially what she's writing about is the flawed practices and how universities are evaluating merit in their applicants. And so what she's describing is, and the way she's framing this is that the college application process is basically rewarding the privilege of those who already have, are fortunate enough to go to the, quote unquote, good schools and have the money to develop their academic and athletic talents. And Mark, the way I want to really start this is with a remarkable statement that is within the article. And the way she poses this is, what if well-endowed institutions of higher education viewed their purpose as cultivating the best and brightest as opposed to simply finding them? First of all, how powerful is that? And what that, the title itself says, we need to push for a radical new way in how we think about how our kids are deserving of admissions and quality education. So she goes through and lists the problems and the solutions. But Mark, I can only imagine, what you're full of right now.
Ideas, energy, thoughts. Yeah.
Man.
So first of all, I want to give her a shout out by name. It's Nadira Farah Foley. And the thing about Nadira, I think that there's several things that make her very credible. First of all, she has as much experience at elite institutions as you'll find. She has a bachelor's from Princeton. She has a master's from Penn. And she's currently actually working on a PhD. It's actually fascinating what she's working on, too. Her research is looking at ways in which race, class, and family structure shape educational opportunities, choices, and trajectories, and looking at inequality, the nexus of inequality, culture, and education. So you can just tell she's a deep sister. So she's got all those experiences, first of all, right, at those 3 Ivy League schools. But then in addition to that, she also did college admissions at an Ivy League school. She did college admissions at Penn for, a little less than 2 years. So she has a really unique lens and perspective that I think is fascinating. But the other thing that she did in this article, which I just thought was just so insightful, so astute, is, do you remember, Anika, when she talked about the book, The Chosen? Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. And What's your recollection of that, if any? Do you have?
Sorry, I don't, Mark. I was hoping you were going to keep
See, you tried to bluff and get away with it. It didn't work.
Edit that out, Esteban.
All right. So I'll talk to you about that because this is a book that I've read and I'm familiar with. And
go ahead. Do that again, Mark.
Yeah. So she starts out, she's talking about this book, The Chosen. And the book, The Chosen, came out about 12 years ago. People in the college admissions wrote. It was a pretty profound book. The subtitle of The Chosen is The Hidden History of Admission and Exclusion at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And what the book does is the book goes through and shows like 104-year history from really like 1900 to 2004. And it looked at how Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, the elite of the elite schools, how they actually did admissions. And what it shows is that Harvard, Yale, and Princeton consistently throughout this 104-year period changed the metrics and their evaluative tactics and tools in order to preserve sort of the ruling class, the Protestant establishment, and to make sure that they in fact would continue to be able to go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And so the very nature we have of what we call holistic admissions, it gets its roots from this, because what was happening was, and I'm just going to be blunt, a lot of people at those schools felt too many Jewish kids were getting in. Because what happens at a lot of well-known schools throughout the world is they just use how you perform on a test is the predominant way to decide who gets in. And the reason why Harvard, Yale, and Princeton went away from that was because they didn't feel like enough the Protestant establishment were getting in. So they had these shifts throughout their history, right? Like early on, it was they made sure that you need to have a classical education. You needed to know like Latin and Greek. And so by doing that, they made sure that they would take people from boarding schools and other very elite schools that were getting that type of education, and those kids wouldn't have to compete with others. Then they went to this huge focus in the 20s and 30s on character. They called it, we want people of character. And they defined character in a way to make sure that certain people got included. So what she's saying is, wait a minute, our very core concept of holistic admissions has its roots in a deliberate attempt to confer opportunities on a privileged class that it was intended to favor or benefit. So she says, so right away she said, that makes me skeptical of it because I've seen how it's been maneuvered over and over in the past in history. So I think that's just an important kind of backdrop to the discussion. And then what she goes on to say is, when it comes to how holistic admissions is done, there are 5 huge areas where they get a tremendous amount of emphasis in the process. Okay, so Anika, let's take the 5 main areas of assessment that she identified. Transcript, standardized testing, extracurriculars, essays, and recs. Can you think of ways in which the privileged, the wealthy, the powerful can take advantage of all of those categories if, in fact, those are ways in which holistic admissions is being determined?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we can even start with the scores, the SAT scores, a kid that's making these spectacular scores. I think that's a direct reflection of the parents having the money to pay for the tutoring that goes into the test prep. So that's one clear example. The recommendation letters, and the author did a great job of explaining this, in that, it's a reflection of what how good the kid is, but it could introduce the bias that the teacher has in the classroom. The extracurricular profile, little Johnny is in lacrosse and all these spectacular things, but that suggests that the parents have, knowledge and resources and access to those things that other children in underrepresented areas wouldn't necessarily have. So, I mean, I think those are key examples that she neatly outlined in the article.
Yeah, and just to agree with you and add even a couple more examples. So let's take, for example, standardized testing. There are people that charge $1,000 an hour to do standardized testing.
Right.
And they're not charging that because they're not good. They're very good. I know of a family that I worked with once. Their kid went from a 12 to a 30 on the ACT because of how much money they invested and how much money they were willing to spend. So,
Right.
there's that component of testing. Then there's all the research that indicates that when parents have advanced degrees, their kids naturally do a lot better in standardized testing because your parents are the teachers. So right from the time they're young, they're being exposed to sophisticated vocabulary. They're seeing models of readers. They're traveling throughout the world, and that benefits grades as well. Then these parents have the savvy and the sophistication to know how to go to administrators and get grades changed or hold teachers accountable and go in. And, the mom usually isn't working a lot of times because the resources allow for that. So the mom's available to just get so involved in the school and have all these meetings with the teachers, where another mom may be working 2-3 jobs, working 60 hours a week, right? So let me give you an example with recommendations. So a couple of schools that I've worked with. One school in California I work with, they have a couple designated recommendation writers who are phenomenal writers. And this is a small school, private school, extremely expensive. So they already know the kids very, very well. So they're already going to write with a level of depth and substance. And the recommendation letters are going to be deep because they have amazing writers who have been completely trained. And so that they take no chances that a recommendation writer won't say the wrong word and, the kid will get dinged. Another school I work with, the lead director of college counseling previews every single rec before it goes out. And if there's anything there that looks like it's inappropriate, then it gets sent back for revisions. I know schools where they've got safety mechanisms in place that if a student's going to get a grade lower than a B, then they have to get departmental approval to do that because they put safety.
That's crazy.
Yes, all these things have been put in place, right? And so what she's basically saying is that the system can be manipulated. Then let's talk about essays. Okay, essays. There's all kinds of people that can do amazing things on your essay so that your child doesn't really write it, or maybe take some concepts and just turns you into Shakespeare. So on every aspect of some of the key things that selective schools use, her point is it can favor the privileged. And do you remember, Anika, what she actually is calling for in a more just society?
Yeah, it's for okay. So here's another powerful piece of this is the actual admissions officers themselves,
Yes.
Mark. So
Yes.
what she's saying is that these folks that are recruited as selecting the next group of elite are the elite themselves. And she even cites this study where this research where they found that this X amount of college admissions officers just about half of them came from these elite school systems, that went through that same, biased process in terms of them not understanding let me say it this way. They understand the nuts and bolts of the job, but they don't understand how important it is to use critical thinking in terms of how they approach the merit. How they evaluate the merit of these applicants. So she's basically saying, Mark, is that we've got these admissions officers themselves need to think carefully about how they evaluate these applicants, going beyond just I'm going to this certain zip code because we've had so many successful applicants out of that zip code, and understand that talent resides everywhere. And she really charged these officers to go and to explore these underserved areas. They got to get into these underserved schools and recognize that merit exists everywhere. And I thought, man, if it was me, after I read this, I felt so compelled to I feel like there should be a campaign going on in terms of, where these admissions officers are going to look for talent.
Yeah, the study you referenced, it was a study of 300 admission officers at 174 selective schools. And they found that more than half of them were graduates of the school, which makes sense in a lot of ways because you want people out there that can talk about their experience. But she's talking about the fact that when you are an upper middle class student who goes to an upper middle class school, there's biases that you have because all of us have this tendency to look for people like ourselves. That's true of anybody in hiring. And this is one thing. You read a quote. I want to read a quote from her that I loved what she said, Anika. She said this: What if elite universities were viewed as high quality, not because they admit children of privilege, but because they leverage their immense resources to improve the lives of students around them? And then she goes on to challenge the very concept of the mission of the school. She said, what if they would audaciously reconceptualize the very mission of their universities with implications from everything from admissions to pedagogy to their role of society? So basically what she's saying is they could change society more if they would identify talented kids who had not had as much privilege, and they could actually move that kid sort of up the ladder more and change their life and change society more. So that's kind of the essence of what she said. Anything else that you want to add?
First of all, how do we make this required reading for every admissions officer, every university president in the world? And I'm so serious because, man, I mean, who doesn't first of all, your schools would be awesome. You would be considered the hero. I mean, just think about the diversity and talent that you could really find if you just jump outside of your box a little bit, folks. And yeah, I don't know.
And you know, Nika, for people that love this stuff, they get into it. They're into like the sociology, the combination of sociology and education, especially as it relates to college admissions, around the subject of equality. I haven't done this in the past, but I'm gonna throw this out there. There are some fantastic books. So the book The Chosen, of course, The Hidden History of Admission and Inclusion at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Another great book is called Creating a Class, College Education and the Education of the Elites by Mitchell Stevens. And then there's a great book called The Price of Admission, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges by Daniel Golden. And then another book called Paying for the Party, How College Maintains Inequality. So those are all books I've read. And they're all, for those of you who are really, really interested in this. And there's another book I've heard great things about. I haven't read it yet. It's called Pedigree, How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs. So I just want to throw in a little bonus content for people that really get into this stuff.
Now it's time for our step-by-step walkthrough of the college admissions process.
All right. I'm super excited, Anika. We are, of course, going through the book, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, and each one of our episode numbers corresponds with a chapter in that book. And we're into the section where we deal with how you should build your college list. And today's chapter is one of the questions I get asked so much, and it's simply this: how many colleges should I apply to? I'm doing a presentation coming up here in a week and a half, and I'm doing a lot of Q&A, and I guarantee I'm going to get that question. So what were some of your key takeaways from this chapter, Anika?
Well, first of all, your point about it being not a one size fits all. Mm-hmm. It's like there's no magic number to say, okay, you apply to 10, or you apply to 5, or you apply to 20.
It's very important.
So I thought, so I thought that was pretty key. And also, and what we learned from you, going through the process with Jalen is of how having the range of schools on your list. You've got, and I'll let you dive into this, but you've got your reach schools, your likely school, your safety school, and having a nice, comfortable number of each of those, just to diversify your list and to ensure that you're having success throughout the process.
Yeah, so I like to think of 5 categories of like what I call lottery schools, and that's just like your chance of getting in are like winning the lottery, so don't even apply, right? Right. And so I say don't even apply there. And then this is going to be my general advice for most people, but there are even exceptions to this. There really are. So reach schools, I recommend 2 to 4. And reach schools are schools for whom your statistical profile, your academic profile, and just your overall qualifications make it look like you're not quite as strong as most kids that they admit, but it's not so out there that you still have a shot at getting in. So if you like that school, go for it. And then you've got, your mid-ranges, or sometimes I call them like coin toss or 50-50 schools. So other people call them target schools. There's a lot of names out there for this category. Match schools, some people use, and they're your schools where it's like, you know what? I just don't know. You may get in, you may not. It is so, you are just right on the cusp of who they typically take. So 2 to 4 of them is standard in most instances. You have your likely schools. I like to see 2 to 4 of them. Likely schools are ones that you should have an 80 to 90% chance of being admitted because you are stronger academically than the overall typical kid that they admit, but it's still not a guarantee that you're in. And then I'd like for you to have at least 1 or 2 safety schools. And do you remember the definition of safety, Anika?
The safety is that it's a goal. It's and not a goal. I'm looking at a basketball game, Mark. Sorry.
You're watching the basketball game. We're doing a podcast. Turn the TV off.
Busted. But no, what it's a score, I should say, is that it's safe. It's safe to say that you are going to get in that school. So here's what I do want you to do, Mark,
Yes.
because I know we went through, there was a calculator, or there was a tool, there was an online tool that we used to quantify. Okay, so I know people are saying, okay, how do I know what a safety school is? How do I know what a reach school is? Like, how do we get to that point of saying, okay, this is the school in this category based on the number of people that they admit, or the people that they waitlist, or what does that process look like in terms of identifying what those safety and reach and goal schools are?
Yeah. So, and just to further what you said about safeties, safeties are schools, going back to last week's episode where we talked about admissions by the numbers. So safety schools are schools that do admissions by the numbers, and you have the numbers, so you're getting in. And a lot of times they're explicit even on their website. A lot of times, what those criteria are. So that's the difference between a safety and a likely. You're going to know that you're in because they do admissions by the numbers. You've got the numbers, you're in. So yeah. So for this, there are a few things with this. So there are certainly a lot of the websites, like I have referred to in the past, they all give you predictive models. They give you scattergrams, which we've talked about. They show the criteria, and you get a sense of who they typically admit. And these would be websites like Niche, NICHE, CapEx, College Navigator, Big Future, and College Data. Those are some of my favorites for this. But I will say this, that you cannot think that information is precise depending on how they do admissions. If it's a school that does holistic admissions, you cannot just go by that. I can predict, and then of course I forgot. How can I forget Naviance? If school uses Naviance, 40% of schools use Naviance. So sometimes I don't mention them because 60% of schools don't use Naviance, but 40% do. That's also a tremendous tool. So once again, these things are not laser-like in their precision. They give you a pretty good read. With my experience, I can come in and help somebody have a little bit more accuracy than that in most instances, but they definitely can give you a good sense in most instances, just to get a general feel. Was that what you're looking for?
It is. Yep. Thank you.
So here's another question. So do you remember in the chapter we talk about certain instances when somebody may want to be on the high end on the application side?
Yeah, so those in need of financial aid.
Definitely.
And correct me, Mark, is it about because we want to get the best package? Is that why you suggest that those, the financial aid candidates would want to increase their list to be able to compare the number of or the type or the quality of packages that they get offered?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One, if you need financial aid, you have a double hurdle. You have to both meet the admission standard, and the money has to work. So you have a double hurdle. There are also a lot of schools that are not need blind. Not being need blind means they're taking your ability to pay into consideration. And so the fact that you need $60,000 to go can hurt you with schools that are not need blind. So it's partly because of the double hurdle. And it's also because money is so significant in terms of a factor in your process that you just need to have a few more offers out there so you can compare. So it's for both of those reasons. And so that's one. Another area where I recommend students would be on the high side of this would be international students. That's another time because of the competition that they face. And then also, if you don't get a chance to visit schools at all, that can be important because you don't really totally have that sense of whether it could be your home away from home. So that could be another reason that you may want to apply to a little bit more. And then another reason is depending on the composition of your list. Now, this is an important thing. So if your list is full of mid-ranges and reaches, then even if you have the likelies on there, but let's say you decide that you want to go with 2 or 3 likelies and 1 safety, then you want to have a stronger list because stuff can happen with those schools. Like actually just this year, so many counselors were blown away because the University of California system had so many more applications this year than they had previously. That schools that counselors thought were likely, kids weren't getting in, and people were like freaking out. So So that's the other side of it. Now, can you think of any instance, Nico, when you may not need that many schools? So, like sometimes you may only need 4 schools. Can you think of? Can you think of? Or
I mean,
or there are cases too. Oh well, go ahead. I was going to tell you the answer, but if I ask you the question, I should give you a chance to answer it, right? Go ahead.
well, no, because I'm just thinking about the quality of it, or the strength, not the quality, the strength of the applicant. And I think about, and I know we talked briefly about the kids that, you see on Yahoo every year or in the news that say, oh, they got into like 20, all the highly selective schools, and they've got all these opportunities. And I just wonder, did they need to apply to all those schools?
Usually not. Not. I usually shake my head when I read those articles. Like, this kid got in all 8 Ivy League schools, and I'm shaking my head. I'm like, do you know how different Dartmouth is than Columbia, or Brown is than Columbia? Like, why would you pick those schools on your list that are so different unless you were just drawn to the status of Ivy? So that's one of those things that counselors, those of us who are experienced coaches, we kind of shake our head at that. But a lot of times people come to me, look at this kid, isn't this amazing? All the schools. I'm like, no, I'm not impressed.
Yeah.
But
oh wow.
But let me answer that for you. So one thing I don't like about the system of reaches and mid-range and likelies and safeties is it kind of implies that your reach is better than your mid-range, and your mid-range is better than your likely, and your likely is better than your safely. And that is a fallacious way of looking at this process. So when you have a kid who, well, I'll give you an example of a kid I'm working with right now. Okay. The dad went to Morehouse. The kid wants to go to Morehouse. He's going to get into Morehouse. I can see by his credentials and qualifications. Okay. He doesn't need to have 12 or 14 schools. And especially, it's even more so if it's a school that does admissions by the numbers and you have the numbers. I mean, if your top choice is a school that's a safety, then you don't have to have a million schools. Joy had like 4 schools because all the schools that she really, really liked, she was like, 385, 39 student. She had like 20 credit hours of college enrollment. She was going to get in them. So she didn't need to have a million schools. Karis applied early decision. So ultimately she only had 1, but she had another 7 schools that she was prepared and had done the Common App, was ready to submit applications for, because Davidson wasn't a slam dunk, So it varies a little bit whether your likelies or your safeties are your top choices, what your number is as well.
Wow.
And the one thing that I will say, Anika, I used to say there's no reason to go above 12. But even there, I learned to never say never in a situation I'm working with now. So I've got a family and I've been working with them for a long time. And this is a really, really strong student. And they're going to have everything completely done by September. And so, and this is unusual. And so they're like, well, what's the harm if we're already done, if we wanted to add another one? And I pushed back and I've said, listen, this is not about, trophy building for your closet here. It's not about a notch in the belt, but you know what I've realized? Who am I to say to them, as hard as they've worked, we are curious if we're going to get in. We just are. Like, I kind of have to leave that with the family. I don't encourage that, but I also have to respect that right if they have that. But I do want to ask you this question, Anika. Why do you think I dissuade people from applying to, 14, 15, 18, 20? I got a call this week from a counselor in New York who said their school is telling kids to apply to 30 schools. So why do you think that's, I generally say, oh my goodness, I do not agree. What do you think? What do you think would be the answer to that?
Well, my best guess is that you're knocking somebody else out the box, because sometimes these slots are so, and obviously you can speak more eloquently than this, but I'm thinking that, some of these cases are competitive. So you might have taken the spot for some other kid to be waitlisted or just put on, be deferred for some reason. I don't know. It's just.
Well, I definitely agree with that. And I've even said that with the family I'm working with this year. Like, you are aware of the fact that your child is so strong that they're likely to be the one kid that gets in to all these crazy selective schools, and you can only go to one. So just be mindful of that. So that's definitely a reason, but there's another reason. And you kind of touched on it in another one of our episodes. Remember when you said, it's so much work? Remember that?
I was going to say that again, but I didn't want to sound lazy.
No, but it's true, because so what I've said to this family, I had a family this year that wanted to apply to 20, and I've got them down to 12. It took a lot of work to get them to 12, but I've got them to 12. And what I convinced them was this: it's better for you to do 12 A and A plus applications than to do 20 B minus B plus applications. And it takes work to do these applications well, especially if they're highly selective schools that do holistic admissions. Just the school-specific essays alone are a lot of work. The relationship building, the cultivation, the communication, the visiting. And guess what? You still need to keep your grades high. You still need to have a life. Remember our whole thing about balanced excellence and not being stressed out?
Right.
So that's it. Time for a question from our listeners.
All right. If you all remember in episode number 6, we did this recap, or we took the opportunity to use our question segment of the show to recap some of the key information in our first 5 episodes. So Mark and I thought this would be a great use and benefit to you all.
Yeah, and I busted on you for being a sound slob, so I got to bust on myself for being a content snob. But I am perfectionistic, so I go back and listen to every episode, and then I think, what else might the listener want to have heard that we didn't throw in? And sometimes just having a month or 5-week separation, the pistons start firing off in my mind, and so this is just a little bonus content.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and dive in, Mark. So we're gonna start with episode number 7. And the article that we talked about discussed the pros and cons in staying on campus. But I know that you want to add a caution around living off campus.
Yeah, and it kind of builds on something we talked about. You remember, Anika, how we talked about how research indicates that those who stay on campus have higher GPAs, they graduate on time, have a higher graduation rate. Do you remember we had that conversation? And I wanted to mention, like, one of the reasons for that is, Think of a magnet. So when you're on campus, there are a lot of magnetic forces that are driving you toward academics. So, I mean, there's people that are being driven to parties too. I'm not trying to say that, but there are academic, like, for one, there's just going to class itself, right? And getting there and getting on time. Right. Then there's the library. Then there's the professor's hours. There's peer tutoring. There's being around academically focused students. There's all of that. When you're off campus, a lot of the magnetic pull is oftentimes not toward academic things at all. And one of the biggest areas where the pull often is towards is to working. And what happens a lot of times is students off campus, they start working, and they start working a lot. And there's some really revelatory research that's coming out that indicates that when students work more than 25 hours a week, their GPAs tend to precipitously drop off. And so the pull is toward, like, work a lot of times into, TV and entertainment, but the pull is not there. It goes in that direction. And that's just something that I just wanted to add as to one of the reasons why students off campus don't graduate as high. And, I've seen this from students I've worked with as well. When you're working on campus or close to campus, a lot of times the employers are more sensitive to your work schedule. But if you're working like 10 minutes away from campus or in the city or something, I don't care about school. Like, you got a job to do. I know you got exams tomorrow, but get your butt here and show up.
That's right. I got 3 very specific students I'm going to make sure listens to this.
Well, we have a share button that we've discovered now. So just hit that little share button on the phone and presto, send it off.
Ooh, I got some people to share with. All right. So episode number 8. We took a question from a listener, and this is about the parent that wanted to understand how to get their kid more engaged in the process, who didn't want to necessarily start so early. And you wanted to add something else for parents to be mindful of when they're doing that.
So it's really great. We touched on this in that episode we talked about how familiarity breeds contempt, find another voice who can deliver that message. And I even think we talked about peers, like if you can have a peer that can deliver that message. But one thing that I found is very, very important is a caution. So if they can hear from a peer who can talk about, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I started early, or if there was one thing I could do all over again, I wish I would have started earlier because it was so stressful. If that peer, or it doesn't even have to literally be a friend, but someone who they would deem as someone who can relate to me, right? If they can approach the student in a way where the parent's fingerprints are not on it, it can be very effective, but it can't be sort of, oh, the parent was like manipulated and manufactured this whole thing for me to talk to you. And I've seen that happen. And the whole thing goes down like a deck of cards. So I'm actually, I have a speaking event coming up, and one of the students who I worked with is setting the whole thing up. And she actually is going to be on the panel, and she wants to deliver this message to the 9th, 10th, and 11th. Like, please don't do what I did. And I think it's going to be very, very effective, because coming from a peer who's lived through it, it's experiential, and nobody can say, you know what, my mama talked to her and told her to talk to me.
Love it. All right. Okay. Episode 9. All right. We had a college counselor that asked, the question was from a college counselor who wanted to know your recommendation on what to advise kids on loan debt. So I have two things we want to cover, but I want to take the first one, Mark. Okay. And it's that, do you have any other recommendations outside of the federal direct loans that you recommend?
Yeah. And that's the reason why that's a really good question, Anika, is because if you remember, we talked about using your projected first year salary as an indication of the amount of loan debt that you can incur. And so the reason why I recommend 80%, by the way, of your first year salary as your total undergraduate loan debt is that's approximately what your take home pay will be. So basically it's like your take home pay for a year. But if you remember, we used 3 examples in that episode. So we used one example of first year pay for a mechanical engineer coming out. And most of his first year pay is like $58,000. I mean, their median pay in adulthood can get 6 figures, but I'm using first year pay. And then we said, well, you know, if it's $58,000, then they can borrow $47,000 based on the 80% rule. And then we said a staff accountant makes $47,000, they could borrow $37,000, where a teacher in Columbus, they may only be able to borrow between $20,000 to $30,000 based on their projected income. But the question is, where do you get the money? Because in that section, that discussion, we talked about how the federal direct loan is the best loan. But we also talked about how there's loan caps in place to make sure you don't take out too much with that loan. And the loan caps are $27,000 over 4 years, or $31,000 over 5 if you take an extra year. And so if you're borrowing $47,000, anybody can do the math, right? 47, 27, there's still $20,000. So where do you get the money? And we're going in future episodes, we'll do a much, much deeper dive in this. It's going to depend on the person and the situation. But some of the sources that should be discussed and evaluated for that extra 20. And, I feel slimy saying this stuff because I've always said, don't take out private loans. Don't ever do a Parent Plus loan. But, one of the things I've learned, you can never say never. There are cases where it makes sense, especially because engineers, they can come out and make a lot of money right back and pay it back. So private loans, if you have really good credit, you read the fine print really, really carefully. They can be a source. Parent Plus can be a source in these rare instances. I normally don't like them. Other things that you want to look at are home equity line of credits and home equity loans in general, what's called a cash out refi. So if you have home equity in your home, and you can refinance and take like $25,000 or whatever out, depending on, how much equity you have in your house, that can be a real low interest way of getting some additional money. And you don't have to, and you can pay it back over 10, 15, 20, 25, even 30 years potentially. So, and then in certain instances, depending on, if your retirement account is really big and you've got a pension, tapping the retirement account. So there's a range of different things. It's going to be customized on a case by case basis, but I thought we should at least talk about, well, where do I get the additional money? And those would be some of the sources.
Right. And speaking of paying it back, Mark, so what could the monthly payments look like on these loans? Like what can they expect in terms of monthly installments?
So that's a great question. And let's focus on the federal direct because it really is the only one that I like people to do in most instances. Things like engineering, nursing, those are exceptions, high paying jobs. So if you're looking at the federal direct student loan, you're going to be looking, most people do what's known as a standard repayment, which means it's a 10-year plan to pay it back. There's all kinds of other methods of paying it back, and we'll talk about those in other episodes. With the 10-year or standard repayment, you're looking at a monthly payment between $279 a month and $350 a month. And Do you have any idea, Anika, why it would be a range? Why didn't I just say it's $283.61?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the amount first and foremost, and
so the amount can vary. But let's say someone takes the full federal direct sub and unsub max, which would be 5,500 freshman year, 65 sophomore year, 7,500 junior and senior year. They graduate in 4 years, 27,000. So we know the amount. I still can't precisely tell you exactly what your payment would be. Why do you think that's true, even that they're fixed interest loans?
I don't have no idea.
It's okay. Don't cry. I'll tell you the truth. I didn't think you would know. Not because most people don't know. Like 98% of people don't know, right? So there's a few reasons for that. One is there's something you can do when it comes to your loans, and you can choose to do this or not do this. And it's a term that's known as capitalizing the loan. So capitalizing the loan has to do with is the interest going to compound over time? And when you find out the amount that you owe, the compounded interest is added in, or are you going to make payments throughout the process and lowering the compounding of the interest? And I always recommend for the unsub loan, remember, for the subsidized loan, the government's subsidizing or carrying your interest while you're in school, right? Full-time student. But for the unsub, it's not. And it's added on at the very end. So if you don't capitalize your loan, and I recommend people do that, if you can pay $100 a month, it will do a lot to if not negate, to significantly reduce. So one, are you capitalizing the loan or are you making contributions? That's one reason. Okay. The other reason is because even that it's a fixed rate for both the sub and the unsub, and even that the rate is the same right now, at least between the two. Like this year's 4.4%, other years it's been 3.8. They're 1 year loans. So you're guaranteed to get the 55 as a freshman, 65 as a sophomore, 75 as a junior, and 75 as a senior. But they're 1 year fixed loans, and the interest rate changes every June. So that's the other reason. So because I don't know what the interest rate's going to be for the next few years, that's why I can't precisely tell you what it's going to be. But you can expect payment somewhere between $279 and $350. And that's why once you start pushing over that amount, I'm not comfortable with people assuming more loan debt than that unless they're going into a very high paying job. And here's the other thing, Anika, they have to graduate, because the worst thing is people that take out all this loan debt and then they don't graduate and then they have the loan debt and they don't have the high paying job.
Painful. All right, Mark, we're moving along. Episode number 10. And in chapter 10, we talked about parents basically telling their kids or trying to dictate to their kids what their college and major or career options should be. And you wanted to add just a few more great things.
Yeah, well, we talked a lot. I said I've seen that a lot with parents wanting their kids to be lawyers and doctors in that discussion. But I got to thinking, and actually I had a couple situations that came up this week. And where I've really seen it, even more than that, I've seen it when parents feel like their kid is not picking either a major that's going to lead to making a lot of money, or if they're afraid that their major will not lead to a job. And so I really have to push back on a lot of parents, because a lot of parents feel as if certain majors don't lead to jobs. And I have to work with them and show them that actually you can take lots and lots of different majors that you don't think will lead to jobs. And if you have a plan, they can lead to great jobs. So that's it.
Right. Okay, cool beans. And then you talked about also in episode 10, we talked about getting off the waiting list. This is the question from the listener where she wanted to know, if there's a strategy to communicate with the college that you've been waitlisted with. And I know you mentioned, I think you did by mistake actually talk about sending a letter, but you said you meant to say send an email, but you actually you wanted to re-comment on that in terms of.
Yeah, you were really helpful there, because you're like, do you mean a letter? and I said no, an email, but here's what I want to add. If you are applying to a very small school and you have like a relationship with your counselor, even if you don't, to be honest, if it's a small school that does holistic admissions and you can get the letter off right away, those are the kind of schools that, every single student is looked at so closely, especially the single gender schools, like the all girls schools. Everyone, they put so much time into that. Those would be the instances when a letter could be fine. Like these small schools that do holistic admissions, that really, really get to know their applicants well. Like, for example, some schools, the actual admissions counselors do interviews themselves. Any school like that, a letter can make sense.
Awesome. Yay. Okay. Finally, in episode 10, we actually talked about the college admissions ratings and applications. And I know you and I have gone back and forth between ratings and rankings and making sure there's a clear distinction and understanding in that. But we're talking about how colleges rate their applicants. What else did you want to add to that, Mark?
Yeah, so in there we talked about how schools do holistic admissions and social engineering. They're handpicking every kid, and the wait list is it's not in a pecking order. Like you're not, I'm number 3 and I'm number 81. So guess what? Number 3 is ahead of number 81. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how the schools actually will go back and look at what exactly they're looking for and they need. And I think the important thing that I want to say with that is these are schools that really do what I call full-blown holistic admissions. Not every school is doing all of that. So there are schools that waitlist that don't look at with such minutia and detail at every applicant, and even when we talked about how admissions applicants are evaluated, and we said by the admission, this was in episode 11, but we talked about how there's admissions by the numbers, the mandatory minimum model, and there's the eligibility index or the freshman index. And then there was the other category that was just holistic admissions. And they're really I think of it as 2 types of holistic admissions. There's full-blown holistic admissions, and then there's just kind of like surface level of holistic admissions.
Okay. All right. And finally, on episode 11, just recently, we talked about the grade inflation. And I'm so glad you wanted to circle back on this, because we talked about the practice of that schools are moving away from class rankings within their high schools. We wanted to drill down a little bit. We didn't go into depth about that. So let's share a little bit more about the rankings.
Yeah, and this is really my bad. And because when I went back and looked at that episode, you kind of asked, you said, why is that? And I just went on a million miles and didn't really answer your question. So, yeah. So
you answered I'm sure, a series of other questions. So you're good.
Thank you. I was like Grace. So we had the discussion about, why there's grade inflation and already. But the reason why schools are moving away from rankings, and there are quite a few reasons for that, really. One of the reasons has to do with the fact that colleges have what I call institutional arrogance. And what I mean by that is you could be at this killer hard school, right? College is always going to think, well, we're way harder than you. That's not always true. I have worked with a lot of students that have said my high school is a lot harder than my college. Colleges never believe that. And you can be at this killer hard school, and you might be, let's say, 20th in your class. Let's say you're 20th. There's a class of 100 and you're 20th, and it's a private school. So there are a lot of colleges that be like, you know what? You're not in the top 10. You're not in the top 5. So we're not that interested in you. But the schools that do that are punishing the student that's at a school for the top 1% or 2% or 3%, because they could go somewhere else and be the valedictorian. And they know that. And because of the fact that the colleges are somewhat beholden, here's the second reason. So first is what I call institutional arrogance. They don't possibly think that a kid that's not at the top could come in and be amazing at their school and have maybe a 3.4 in high school and have a 3.8 at their school. Institutional arrogance. Another reason is because the colleges, they're very rankings centric, and they're very concerned with all these guides that they have to report all their numbers to. And one of the common statistics you'll see in these guides is what percentage of kids are in the top 10%. So if they feel like you're going to, what I call, hurt their profile, then they'll punish a kid who's not going to make them look good in their numbers. And the third reason is because, remember we talked about before how upper middle class and upper class kids and schools are pretty savvy. They know that this happens. So they're like, well, we're not going to give you a chance to hurt our kid because they attended a more competitive school and you don't like their ranking. So we'll just remove rankings from the equation so you can't use it.
Okay, so what do they replace that with then? I mean, if that's the process, or if that's the practice that the college uses, and the high school doesn't have rankings, do they still pull from that high school?
Yes. The reason why is there are too many schools that don't use rankings anymore. So it would really absolutely not be in the college's interest to punish that kid. In fact, there was one year that one selective school in New England said only 20% of kids that applied had rankings. The national averages are more in the 40 to 50 range. So they can't afford to just punish the school that doesn't have it because they would be hurting themselves. It'd be the equivalent of a school saying, we're only taking the ACT. Do you know how many applicants they would lose? Because half the people take the SAT, right? Or 48%. But it does just mean that the college has to use other things. Schools that do holistic admissions, that like full-blown, what I call full-blown holistic admissions, they will really study the school profile. And a lot of times on the school profile, it will you'll be able to see, like they'll break a lot of the good ones, they'll have GPAs broken down in deciles by groups of 10. So like maybe the bottom 10 decile was like a 2.5 to a 2.74. Then the next was like a 2.74 to a 3.03. They'll do that. And so they can actually indirectly figure out where the kid is in the class by looking at their grade point average and then going in and doing that. So they'll put more emphasis on the school profile. Other schools that don't do admissions, they don't have the staff or the resources to have that type of attention. They'll just use other factors, which is normally going to be what are the big three, Anika? Do you remember what the big three?
Oh yeah, their GPA, their standardized test scores, and what's the
courses they've taken, the rigor,
and the courses they've taken.
And here's the thing: even so, that's true for admissions by the number of schools. It's also true for holistic admission schools. Those are the big three. Are still the big three. Anika, before we close out this episode, I have to give a huge shout out to Marion Henderson in Westchester, Pennsylvania, because she approached me with an idea about 8 weeks ago after she heard our first episode. She's like, this will be perfect for all the ladies that I know who have kids in 10th grade and 11th grade that are going through this process. I'm going to start up like a podcast discussion group. And so, so she's pulled together like about 10 ladies, and they are listening to our episodes as a group like you would in a book. And they have their coffee and their tea or their munchies. And then they have a discussion. And I just thought that was such a great idea. And so kudos to Marion and all the ladies in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Downingtown, Chester County. And if any of you else out there want to copy Marion, kudos.
Oh, man. I love the action-oriented mamas. They rock.
I like that name, action-oriented mamas.
Name y'all's discussion group after that, the action-oriented mamas. There you go.
Hint.
Great job, ladies. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. And if you find this podcast helpful, it would help us tremendously if you would subscribe and write us a review on your favorite podcast listening station. And please be sure to click the share button and send it to someone you know who could really use this information. The amazing music that you hear is by Victor Allen Weeks. Artwork is by Andrea Togo. Marketing designs are by Kimberly Blass. And Your College Bound Kid is produced by Esteban Sartho. If you want to get a copy of the book, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, you can go right to 171answers.com. And if you would like to have a college coaching session with Mark, you can send him a text at area code 404-664-4340.
And if you have a question or a few questions that you would like for us to answer on each show, please email us at questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. That's questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Every week, we'll take one question and include it in the episode. We don't like your questions. We love your questions, so send them our way. And by the way, check out our website, which is just simply yourcollegeboundkid.com. Again, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to meeting with you again next week.